Right, we will go ahead and get started since it's the top of the hour. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, as always. Welcome to the monthly webinar series hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. My name is Heather Yoakum, and I am the Stakeholder Engagement Lead here at the NCCASC. And I organize this webinar series along with my colleague, Imtiaz Ringwala, who is the Climate Science Lead here at the NCCASC. And we bring you these monthly webinars to facilitate a discussion of science and research and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate. And we focus on the North Central region in the US, which for us at the NCCASC means that that's the states of Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. So before I introduce our speaker for today, just a quick word on housekeeping. So we are recording this webinar, and you can find all of our previous webinars and recordings on our website. And I'll drop the link to that in the chat in just a moment. You can also find them on our YouTube page, and I'll put that link in as well. So during the webinar, all of the participants will be muted, and you can submit your questions and comments through the chat during the presentation. And we'll start with those questions and comments during the Q&A at the end of the presentation, and we'll ask them in the order that they were received. And so after we've asked all of those questions, please feel free to unmute yourself and pose your questions directly to the presenters if we have time. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Amber Runyon is an ecologist for the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, or CCRP, where she collaborates with park managers to provide management-relevant projections of future climate that serve as the basis for climate-informed planning. And Amber has a PhD in ecology from just up the road from Colorado State University. And unfortunately, David Lawrence is unable to join us today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Amber.
All right. Thank you, Heather. And thanks to both Heather and Imtiaz for inviting me to speak to this webinar series. It's always cool to hear what people in the region are doing. And I'm excited to present to you today really something that we've been working on for the last 10, 15 years, but some new developments that we have in this. And like she said, my co-presenter, David Lawrence, is unable to present today, but also there are several other co-authors who've contributed significantly to this work over the years. It's also John Gross and Gregor Schuurman and Joel Reynolds from the National Park Service, and then one of your own, Brian Miller from the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center has contributed to all of this as well. So I'm presenting on tools for developing reproducible climate futures for resource planning. And climate change, as you all know, it isn't something far off into the future. Parks have already experienced significant warming. We call this, affectionately refer to this plot as the measles map. And it's from a study in 2014 that looked at historical climate trends in parks and found that 81% in the lower 48 had mean temperatures more extreme than 95% of the historical range of conditions. And this warming is already impacting parks. Here we have a few of those that have occurred recently from Taos Pueblo that was threatened by a wildfire. Cape Hatteras Lighthouse had to be moved in 1999 due to sea level rise, and it's already creeping up on its doorstep again. And then habitat is shifting across parks faster and further than species can adapt to. So the key point here is that climate change is happening now, not far off into the future, and we're already seeing effects on park resources. And more climate changes are anticipated. Not just the change that we've already experienced, but also there will be continued inevitable change that we will experience as a consequence of previous emissions, regardless of how we change our behavior in the future. And so the National Park Service has organized its response to adapt to this climate change. And two fundamentals of that adaptation are developing forward-looking goals that consider future climate conditions and considering more than one scenario of the future. And when planning, we often look to the past to guide what the future will look like and tend to be overconfident in our ability to predict that future. This can lead us to think narrowly and leave ourselves open to surprises. On the other hand, scenario planning is not based on the past, but looks to all plausible potential futures. It's highly valuable in situations of irreducible uncertainty because it encourages thinking broadly about possibilities and allows managers to proactively plan how they would respond to different scenarios. And this allows us to engage explicitly with climate change uncertainty and helps decision makers identify strategies that are robust to a range of futures, including those with low probability but potentially high consequence events. It also diminishes the role of climate prediction and reduces the need for over-optimized adaptation strategies that only work if that prediction is correct. So scenarios are tools that allow us to sort of rehearse the future if we think in advance about what that future might be. So benefits of scenarios are it leads to quicker reactions to a changing world because we've already thought about it, more flexible plans, innovative ideas, and early and broad risk identification. And the Park Service has been doing scenario planning since 2007. You can see over on the right, the history of more than 30 climate change scenario planning workshops that we've done involving 90+ parks, regions, and networks, and over 125 partners. And many of these actually have occurred in the North Central region involving the NCCASC. So an early and essential step in developing plausible scenarios is generating what we call climate futures, which is what I'm talking about today. And those are descriptions of the physical climate attributes that could plausibly occur at a specific place and time. So when working with climate futures, it's useful to focus on climate metrics that are relevant to resource decisions. And multiple climate futures are used to consider the range of ways that things could play out. Climate futures characterize uncertainty, and divergent climate futures in particular describe the broadest range, potential range of futures that we may experience. And climate futures support information needs of decision makers by allowing them to understand the spectrum of change that their resources may experience, and then develop strategies that are robust to that range of potential climate futures so that they can avoid highly consequential surprises. So you may ask, what's the difference between climate futures and scenarios? Often the terms are used interchangeably. And so this little graphic helps us to think about it. Climate futures are descriptions of the physical attributes of the climate, like that little drawing below. It might be days over a certain threshold or average winter temperatures. And then on the right, climate resource scenarios use climate futures to identify potential resource implications of those climate futures. And this is generally done in collaboration with managers and resource specialists. And then this leads to decision making, and scenarios are used to develop and inform adaptation strategies and inform those management decisions and then feed them into planning. So throughout this 15 years, two key challenges that have arisen are first, creating scenarios that capture as much relevant uncertainty as possible to avoid surprises, and then how to scale up these approaches to help more managers use climate futures and scenarios is the new challenge that we're facing. So what I'm going to talk about today is a story in two parts. The first, chapter 1, as I'm calling it, is really a lot of the work that we've done over the last decade, and that's developing methods to capture as much of that uncertainty as possible so managers can make robust decisions. Then chapter 2 is a story that's still playing out, and it's developing methods and tools to scale the use of climate futures to meet the growing demand that I know we're all experiencing. So the first part, some of you are probably on this webinar, but in January, Dave Lawrence gave a webinar on this topic for the national CASC webinar series. If you were on it, I apologize. Some of these next slides will probably look very familiar. If you were not, it's definitely worth checking out. He did a great job and went to a lot more detail than I'm going to be able to go into of telling this story through a really compelling case study. But this is fundamental background to get to some of the tools and understand some of the tools that we've created. But I apologize for the redundancy and encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen this. So this part of the story has a beginning, middle, and an end. I'll start by introducing Big Bend as an example where climate futures were used to help with a water management decision. I'll describe 3 approaches for generating climate futures, then compare uncertainty captured by those approaches, and then finish by describing key considerations and trade-offs when selecting approaches. So Big Bend is a park on the southern border of Texas characterized by a very arid climate and low water availability. It's already extremely warm compared to the past, and there's every indication that it will continue to warm even under the most conservative future scenarios. In 2018, park managers were making decisions about how best to redevelop a spring in a mountainous area of the park, which you see here. And they came to us to understand how reliable that spring and its water source may be in the future. And here's a quote from the Big Bend superintendent, Bob Krubenaker. This sums up this problem they were facing, where he says, we need to understand not what the future will look like, because nobody can predict that, but we do need to understand the range of possible futures to plan for. So I'll show 3 approaches for creating climate futures at Big Bend. So for starters, to create those climate futures, we used gridded climate data using MACA downscaling, which is about 4-kilometer resolution. And we selected a single grid cell that fell over the recharge area for that spring. We used data from 20 global climate models, all of them both projected under a medium and a high emissions pathway, which gave us 40 projections. And we focused on 30-year climate periods, 2040s, what we considered a near-term period, 2060s, a medium term, and 2090s, which is a long term, which for that effort was really what they were concerned about because of the length that the investment needed to last. And we compared all of those to a historical period of 1950 to 1999. Here are those projections for the near term 2040, plotted out. Again, it's all change relative to 1950 to 1999. And so you can see here, all of those projections indicate that it'll be warmer from the past, just with varying degree. But there's some uncertainty in the direction of change for precipitation. So the first approach for creating climate futures is based on representative concentration pathways, RCPs, or emission scenarios. And these have been used broadly by the international community, and GCMs are driven by RCPs to produce projections the scientists use to evaluate climate change. They reflect a really broad range of socioeconomic futures and provide a convenient means to build climate futures because you have 2 scenarios. And the divergence among these 2 climate futures represents uncertainty regarding greenhouse gas emissions. And here the stars on that bottom plot represent the divergence you get when averaging RCPs. And this is for the 2040 period again. So approach number 2 is what we call the quadrant approach. And you can see in the lower plot, how we create those is if you take that same scatter plot, but consider all models equally, so we're not thinking about RCPs anymore, divided into quadrants using the mean value of each axis. And then the quadrants are defined by excising the central tendency, which is that box in the middle, and it's defined by the 25th and 75th percentile change for each axis. Then the average values of the projections within each of those subquadrants represent a climate future. So over in the upper left, we have a warm, wet future that has increasing temperature, but also increasing precipitation. And that's probably, at least for the water decision at Big Bend, was the best case scenario. Then in the lower right, we have our worst case scenario, which is characterized by much larger increases in temperature and decreases in precipitation. And that's the most divergent from the warm, wet climate future. Then we have our third approach, which is what we call the individual approach. And this selects projections to capture maximal divergence on the metrics selected for the scatter plot axes. So in the Big Bend application, we selected individual projections that characterize a divergent warm, wet, and then a hot, dry climate future. And when possible, individual projections should be vetted for a geography before they're relied upon to present a plausible climate future. So if certain models don't necessarily do well in a region, those might not be considered as highly as some other ones. So it's a bit more involved to create these. So to compare the range of uncertainty captured by these approaches, here you can see in 2040 the uncertainty of the three different approaches with the RCPs on the top, quadrant in the middle, and then individual on the bottom. And what we see here is that individual projections and quadrant averages capture a much greater range of uncertainty than the RCPs in 2040s. But then next we can look at the divergence that you get across different time horizons, because often we're using different time periods for different planning windows. So we have 2040s again, which is near term planning, 2060s, which is middle term, and then 2080s, which is long term. And the blue and orange dots are our projections under those two RCPs, where blue is 4.5, orange is 8.5, and then the individual models are selected are characterized in blue and red. And warm, wet again is the best case, hot, dry is the worst case. So I'm going to walk through some of these results, but in the plot on the right, you can see again that range of uncertainty captured for the individual projections for the three time periods, with the divergence of the models increasing through times. If we focus in on 2040 and compare that individual projection to the quadrant and the RCP, what you see is that the quadrant method captures about half of the divergence that the individual does. So it's still pretty good. And in the RCP is about 14% of that. And then if we look to 2060 and 2080, we see pretty much the same thing, that the quadrant is about half, and then RCP is about a quarter of the divergence captured. So the bottom line here is that individual and quadrant averages capture a much greater range of uncertainty than RCPs, creating climate futures that are more plausible, divergent, and relevant. We can walk through the same for precipitation, where individual models capture much of the range. And I'll just go ahead and uncover all of these for sake of time. But interestingly here, and actually in many parts that we see for precipitation, the range of uncertainty captured by RCP-based climate futures is almost non-existent, regardless of what time you're looking at. And then individual is the most, and then quadrant is in the middle of the two. For a park like Big Bend, where the water supply system for this particular question is primarily controlled by contemporary precipitation, using an RCP-based approach would have led to climate futures or scenarios and missed much of the plausible outcomes. So that was a key finding here. So some of the key considerations when selecting approaches, really the key message here is that there's no one size fits all. Really the choice depends on the decision you're trying to inform and the resources you have available to put into working with climate futures. If your emphasis is mitigation, the RCP approach is the best because it's the only one that accounts for emissions. If adaptation is your focus, the quadrant or the individual approaches are better. For scenario planning, we find it best to use an approach that results in climate futures that are plausible, divergent, and relevant in order to challenge entrenched mindsets. And so for near-term planning, individual and quadrant are the only way to really capture that divergence between scenarios. Then the last consideration is ease and difficulty of approach. The National Park Service typically uses the quadrant approach as a course filter evaluation when we're doing simpler scenario planning exercises and we don't have a lot of resources to put into it. And then we use individual projection approach for more detailed investigations where we have a bit more time for model choice and evaluation, which I'll get into some of the tools we use kind of changes that a little bit, but that's still our broad approach. And there are many other examples where CCRP has used climate futures for resource management. I've got several of those reports listed here, and there are actually many others. And that's because climate futures can serve as fundamental climate change exposure information to aid in simple to complex vulnerability assessments and adaptation questions that may come up. And here we have Knife River Indian Villages National Historic Sites, Badlands National Park, Devil's Tower, Wind Cave, and then most recently Wrangell St. Elias, which most of these were from the North Central region and were developed in collaboration with the NCCASC. So like I said, this first part of the story has a beginning, middle, and end. So here are some conclusions. That divergent and plausible climate futures support decision makers' need to consider a range of potential futures to avoid surprises. The goal of climate futures is to explore relevant uncertainty among projections of change. A set of climate futures that are divergent, plausible, and relevant support scenario-based planning and help identify strategies that work across all climate futures or that don't work under any of the climate futures or are needed to address particularly high consequence vulnerabilities specific to a subset of scenarios. The individual projection and quadrant average climate future approaches capture a much broader range of plausible future conditions than the RCP approach for both near and long-term projections. But choosing among the different approaches depends upon the application and available resources. And NPS has had success using climate futures and scenario processes for a wide variety of management contexts. So that will lead to the next chapter of this story, which is developing methods to scale up the use of scenarios and climate futures to meet a growing demand that we have for them. Like I said, and unlike the previous section where we've made a lot of advancements, we've tested, we've done a lot of work in it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end to that story. This one is much more still in the works. It's in development. And this is kind of like a current status of where we are. We are already seeing climate change happening in parks. And in particular, recently, we've seen a lot of climate disaster. And the magnitude and rate that these are occurring seems to be occurring and increasing faster than we can respond. So here we have a few just within the last couple of years that I pulled out. Rapid permafrost thaw in Denali National Park, exacerbated landslide activity, forcing road closures up in the upper left. Then historic wildfires have led to mature sequoia tree mortality that actually had not been thought possible previously. In 2021, the Dixie Fire burned 69% of Lassen Volcanoes National Park, and there's a long list of parks with significant fire damage in recent years that I could have added to this. And then in 2021, down on the bottom right, 5 inches of rain in 3 hours in Acadia washed out historic trails and roads, and it was an event that the park called one of the most exceptional weather events in the park's history. So these are just a few. Then on top of that, our marching orders reflect this situation of increasing concern. So in the past year alone, we've received climate change as one of the top 4 challenges that must be addressed as identified in the Secretary's priorities. The second, confronting the climate crisis, was listed as number 3 on the NPS director's priorities. And then even Congress has gotten involved. In 2020, there was passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which was $1.5 billion per year for 5 years for maintenance and on facilities and infrastructure. But as part of that, all projects were required to consider climate change resiliency for funding. So that there has been institutional demand as well for climate scenarios and considering climate change. So this has led our program to go from producing about climate futures for about a dozen parks a year to needing to serve all 423 units in the NPS system. And this reflects our reality, and I know that there are a lot of other agencies on the call who are experiencing similar demand and challenges. So in response to this, CCRP launched a project last year called Reproducible Climate Futures that focuses on improving climate future analysis. So as part of this project, we've designed workflows that make climate future production more efficient and automated so we can produce climate futures for all parks. All of the analytical and data management processes now adhere to reproducible research standards, which is important, particularly since before we were doing a lot of one-off efforts. And we've developed tools to increase accessibility and scale climate future production. And the efficiency part is really more internally focused, but I'll spend the rest of this talking about advances in both reproducibility and accessibility to other audiences so more people can produce and use climate futures. So that's what the rest of this is on. We have found 2 barriers towards accessibility of climate futures. The first is data access. So this method for creating climate futures, both the individual and the quadrant, uses quite a lot of climate data and requires access to that data. So it requires global climate models, all global climate models, for a fairly long period of time. And until recently, everything was stored locally on RAID arrays that could only be run by one person and one time because they required physically plugging in. And often that was me. And this, with COVID, became particularly challenging because before anyone at least in our office, could run these, but now that drive sits in my closet. So I am the roadblock. The second challenge was generating climate futures. So the code base that we use to do this and create all of the associated metrics and output is again also locally stored and in a form that isn't super easy to access or shareable. So to solve the first problem with data access, the NCCASC and Earth Lab created an R package that many of you are probably familiar with called the Climate Futures Toolkit, or CFT. And this package can extract climate projections needed to create climate futures in a very reasonable amount of time. This has really been essential for our ability to serve climate futures to more parks and make running climate futures easier, and is critical for anyone else who wants to use these tools. The second barrier, actually generating climate futures, this figure on the right, I don't intend you to read or know what any of that stuff means, but it actually is or was our workflow. Each box is a separate script with inputs and outputs that had to be run in the right order. And as you can imagine, it was pretty complicated to run and potentially error prone. And it worked, but it's very much a one-off approach and had almost 10,000 lines of code. So not something that you can just put out in the world and expect others to be able to readily use. To add to this challenge, one of the points highlighted earlier on in the previous section was the sometimes difficulty of creating individual projections, which has led us to use a quadrant approach pretty often. And that was really with the model selection when you're wanting to select individual models. So to solve the problem of complicated generation of climate futures, we've created an accompanying R package called Reproducible Climate Futures, or RCF. And this essentially is functions that create quadrant and individual climate futures. And it converts that entire workflow into 5 functions, which I'll walk through the contents of those functions and what they do, and then some resources and available to start using this and training that we have. So the first function is this flow chart is how one would work through this workflow of creating climate futures, which you start over at the top left, getting data. The first function, this RCF data function, is actually a wrapper for the CFT package. It downloads MACA data for your location of interest and then formats it to run through the other functions nicely. It's not a requirement. You can bring in other data from other downscaled climate if that's your preference, or you can download your own data from the CFT. Doesn't really matter. This one is nice, and we created it because it formats the data to feed right into the others. So if you were bringing in your own, you would want to reformat the data as well, but there's guidance on that. But the CFT package is a dependency of this function. The next is calculate thresholds. And this function simply takes that raw data and calculates threshold variables for 21 threshold variables. And I have a few of those listed here. It's anything from minimum or maximum temperature to precipitation to more threshold type variables like days with extreme precipitation, or freeze-thaw cycles, or growing degree days, or growing season length. And these are all variables that we've found in scenario planning that we've done in the past to be quite useful for managers to get to their climate sensitivities of their resources. The next part of this, and where this ties up with the previous section, is selecting your climate future method. We can, if you follow this, there's the simple bivariate methods that I was showing before, where you're using temperature and precipitation and selecting quadrants or individual projections based on those. But we've also added a function for multivariate selection, which I'll get into explaining that, but that was something that was identified as a need to be able to do. And one of the reasons that this has been so difficult in the past to create individual projections. So the function CF quadrant, if you select method equals quadrant, you will get climate futures based on temperature and precipitation using quadrant methods. It's pretty simple. If you use that same function and select method equals individual, you will get individual climate futures for that bivariate selection based on temperature and precipitation. And the method that we used for this was an approach identified by the EPA in a report that they wrote and a tool they created called the LASSO tool. And in this, they actually identified multiple different methods for selecting projections. The one we used was the one that they called, we modified it a bit, but it's called the corners methods. And this created the most divergent scenarios. And how that is done is if you take this scatter plot like we were looking at before, and you draw a bounding box around the extreme points for each of those axes, then it selects the models that are the closest to the corners of that bounding box. And so you end up with your most extreme models for each of those quadrants. However, when we're doing more of the really what we call deep dive efforts that are more involved, often we compare about more than two facets of climate. So here's an example from Devil's Tower planning process, where the priority resources that they were concerned about for that planning effort are listed on the left column in that table. They were historic structures, tower exfoliation, vegetation, erosion, and then visitor and safety staff. And so we selected climate futures based on metrics that characterize the climate sensitivities of each of those resources. And the list is there on the right. So things like freeze thaw, extremely hot days, mean and maximum summer water deficit, large precipitation events. And for that effort at Devil's Tower, we selected projections that capture the most divergence among all of those axes. And it involved 4 of us sitting around a table for a couple of weeks looking at scatter plots, which some of them are over on the right, of each of those combinations of different metrics and debating which were the best model combinations to capture the broadest range of divergence across all of those. So pretty time-consuming process and not perfect, to say the least, but we did a pretty good job there. So in this package, we're using principal component analysis for the same multivariate selection, which is a statistical tool that's able to represent variance of more than 2 variables by essentially placing multivariate data sets on a 2-dimensional grid, which allows them to be read easier while maximizing the variance that's represented. So for climate future selection, we can identify the variables that we're interested in. And many of those are derived variables. Like I said, growing season length, winter precipitation, summer droughts, some of these derived variables. And then we can select models at the extrema of principal components 1 and 2. And I've actually tested this against all of the parks where we've manually selected models, and it did identify most of the models that we selected for those efforts in the past when we did this process manually. And this is run by the CFPCA function in this. So you're probably all thinking, this is really cool. How do we use it? We have developed a lot of training and resources available for this R package. And I will go ahead and say, we were hoping to have this package released before this webinar. We're still in the middle of the review that's required for it to be posted on the CRAN repository. One of the downsides of having so much demand for climate futures is that this is a little bit behind. So it's not quite finished yet. It will be by this summer. But we've developed vignettes, both for running the standard quadrant and individual climate futures, as well as the principal component analysis climate futures, which we've created a separate, more detailed tutorial for that because it's really a separate case and probably for more advanced users. We also have a lot of example scripts that one could run to create a lot of different plot types from the output. And so you can get a lot of output from these example scripts. And then we are having hands-on training workshops that'll be held in the coming months. When Dave gave his webinar in January, I think he'd said that we were having it this spring. That was the hope. Now it looks like it'll be this summer. If you are interested in these, you can reach out to me and I'll put you on the distribution list for sign up whenever we announce them. And all of this work over these years requires a lot of acknowledgements, which I have listed here on the right. People who've helped conceptualize scenarios and climate futures, down to a long list of research assistants who actually helped write the code to develop some of these tools. And I'll finish here and open it up to any questions with the remaining time that we have.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amber, for that amazing presentation. It was so very thorough. And I know you guys have done so much work over the last couple of years, so I appreciate that. We do have a couple of questions. Let me pull them up for you. First of all, I do want to direct people. Amber had mentioned Dave's USGS webinar, and we put the link for that in the chat. So scroll up if you don't currently see it and you're looking for that. A question from Robin O'Malley. So hi, Robin. Incorporating multiple futures could be, or how would incorporating multiple futures work under NEPA? Would that be difficult, or yeah, how might that work?
That's a good question and not something that I've actually encountered. I would maybe open that up for discussion to those on the call. When we're using scenarios, it's normally pre-NEPA phase. And then once the decisions are made, then that, if it requires a NEPA process, then those would be evaluated. But I don't actually know the answer to that. Sorry,
and actually,
Robin.
Amber, could you just explain a little, like a real quick thing of what NEPA actually is for folks on the call who maybe don't know, just in case?
I'm not the person to ask about that. I'm not an NEPA expert. We have a whole different division that does that. I'll ask Robin. I'll punt that back to Robin and ask him to explain it.
Robin, are you on? Can you chime in here for a moment? Maybe. All right, maybe not. Well, we'll come back to that one. Question comes from Louis. I'm probably going to mispronounce your last name, so I'm just going to say P. Do you know if only a subset of the GCMs apply to Big Bend? For example, the Scripps Institute determined that only 10 GCMs would apply to the Southwest USA, but not sure if Big Bend counts as in the Southwest or maybe a different region. And if there are other GCMs that were designed to address issues in other parts of the world. So I think getting to some of your points about like regional, figuring out which ones might work regionally.
Yeah, this is something that we've gone back and forth with over the years and talked to a lot of climatologists about this question and actually begged people to come up with lists of regionally which models work and which don't. And when we say work, we mean which ones do have good model performance when trying to recreate the historical climate. And there's a document from the Forest Service that we use often that has, for some of the regions, it has identified which models work pretty well and which ones don't. And earlier on in our earlier efforts with climate futures, particularly Devil's Tower and Wind Cave, we consulted that document and actually just eliminated models from consideration that didn't work as great in those regions. Then after some consultations with other climatologists, we ended up leaving in all 20 GCMs that are available in the MACA, in the MACA-Dillon scale data set for some of the more recent ones we've done, because they were not trying to be predictive. And so they are all fairly plausible representations of the future, and they're just scenarios. So even though they might not be as great at performing as some of the others, we still consider them, particularly if they might provide insights about a climate that might play out. And the guidance that we've received that we are going by right now is not to eliminate models or up front, but consider them in the suite of models that we're considering, even if they don't perform quite as well. But then if we're selecting between two, that's where we would use model performance as a consideration. And if all things equal, it's between two models, but one happens to perform better, we would use that. And this is, like I said, it's something that we're still internally debating. So that's where we are now, but that might not be where we land forever.
Excellent, thank you. And that actually leads perfectly into our next question from Joel Smith. And so he says, thank you very much. This is a sound approach and well presented. And his question is about why in that kind of first example you gave in chapter 1, there wasn't a third scenario. So you talk kind of about 2 different scenarios, but not a third one. And if, I think the question is more just about like, maybe selecting one that might be between, 2 different scenarios, or how do you decide 2 versus 3 maybe?
Yeah, so we found in all of these 2 to 4 is the sweet spot of the number of scenarios. Fewer than 2, obviously, then you're not doing scenarios. More than 4, it's just too much complexity. And really, even in some of the more recent ones we've done, 4 can be too much in a scenario planning context. For the Big Bend example, we chose 2 because we were really focused on the best and worst case scenarios. I think where you might want 3 or 4 scenarios are where you're considering more than 2 variables. So for like the Devil's Tower example I showed later on, we had 5 variables we were considering. And so we chose 4 climate futures to try and capture the broadest range of uncertainty among all of those. For Big Bend, we were just considering temperature and precipitation. And so that got us a best and worst case scenario. And for that question, it was the appropriate complexity for that research question. We don't select those 2 bounded and created the most, bounded the uncertainty. The uncertainty that was appropriate for that question. And we didn't select one in the middle because that would be more of just an average and not actually quite as useful for that scenario planning context, where we were wanting them to think about what would happen in your best case and in your worst case.
Excellent, thank you so much. So now we have a couple of questions from Dominique Bachelet. So one is about data access and that data storage capacity, data access and data storage capacity, and that climate data files are large and not everyone has large enough data drives to be able to compare and store multiple GCMs and scenarios. Do you have kind of recommendations for working around this, or how you've dealt with that?
Yeah, this is our biggest challenge. This is our biggest challenge. The CFT package was really, it is a huge leap in our ability to access climate data, because instead of having to store 16 terabytes of gridded climate data for daily data for all 40 projections locally, and then pull from those, we are able to pull down just the grid cell that we're interested in. And so it reduced it from about 16 terabytes to, I think all said and done, the data for one location to create climate futures is maybe 500 megabytes. So that was a huge advancement, but then it still requires a lot of computational power to run through that many GCMs and run through all of that data. And doing it recently, we've been trying to automate doing this for all parks, and we've had to shift to some cloud services for both storage of that data and even running some of these projections, which isn't an option for a lot of people. It's barely an option for the Park Service. With CMIP 6 coming out, I believe that data accessibility is going to be much better, and even the ability to use things like Google Earth Engine to manipulate and work with some of those GCMs before you actually have to pull that data down off the cloud. And so some of those tools will hopefully help make this more broadly accessible when it comes out the next year or two.
Great. And actually, I'm going to skip a few questions because there was one question about CMIP 6. So I think you just answered that. But is the tool right now, what does it use? Is it based on CMIP 5?
It is CMIP 5,
Okay.
but we will be updating to CMIP 6 whenever it comes online.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay. And then another question about the GCM results. So when you were looking at those like less than or greater than 1 inch precipitation events from the GCM results, were you using daily projections or?
Yes, daily.
All right.
Yeah, all of this is working with daily data so that we can calculate some of those threshold metrics that are often best characterized as sensitivities of resources.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then these are some questions kind of about applications. So have any parks yet applied these approaches to assess sea level rise, like on the National Seashores or Cape Hatteras, or any of those other parks that you know of?
So we do have coastal parks that have applied these methods, but not for projecting sea level rise. I think all of the sea level rise projections I've seen still use RCP-based approaches, which is fine, but that's what's available right now.
Okay. And then another question about, do you have examples? And I know you went into this a little bit, but do you have examples of how parks are using this information? So is it to create plans for managing infrastructure or developing species-specific habitat suitability models, or different things like that?
Yeah, all of the above. So I focused on scenario planning here because the climate futures framework really is embedded in that need to consider multiple scenarios of change when planning for the future. And a lot of what we are focused on is helping parks plan and not plan for a past that may not be their situation currently and never will be again, but instead think about the future. So one type of effort that we're very engaged in is what's called resource stewardship strategies, which all parks perform and all parks use climate futures as part of those, and think about the two scenarios of future change as they develop their goals and strategies to achieve those goals for those park plans. And those are 5 to 10 year plans that all parks have. But we also have used these in, yesterday I gave a presentation for Tule Springs fossil beds. They're putting together, it's a new park, they're putting together a general management plan. And we created climate futures for them and looked at some potential impacts under those 2 climate futures that they may want to consider. And they're using that for their general management plan, particularly as they're setting desired conditions, that they don't identify conditions that are past conditions that aren't representative of potential future conditions. What are some others? A lot of infrastructure projects, particularly with the Great American Outdoors Act. Every single one of the 75-ish projects that were considered were required to consider the climate resiliency of the project. And so they used climate futures to understand potential vulnerabilities, because essentially what the climate futures products were presenting allow parks to do is do kind of a mini rapid vulnerability assessment, and then incorporate that into their planning. We also work quite a lot with the NPS Inventory and Monitoring Division, and using climate futures for using that inventory monitoring data to think about species and species conditions in the future.
Great. And I think we've got time for one more. So I'll pose this to you. Does the code or the tool allow for evaluating seasonal precipitation for like growing seasons? Or does it incorporate projections for evapotranspiration, ET, or other ecological drought indicators?
Yeah, and I didn't get into all of those details yet, but so there are those 24 variables that are calculated from the daily projections, and those are things like average temperature, precipitation, growing season length, extreme precipitation, days over the historical 95th percentile for temperature and precipitation, stuff like that. And there is a function that summarizes them on the annual, monthly, and seasonal time periods. And I think you can define those seasons. The default is December, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, and so on. But then also we have actually the ability and some modules that we're adding onto it to look at drought using SPEI calculations, as well as we have water balance model run for all of, well, 13 of the GCMs that you can select climate futures from and pull that data in. And so that includes climatic water deficit, soil moisture, snow, a lot of other water balance metrics for that. That's what we used to characterize drought and ecological drought most often. And those, particularly the water balance metrics, are what we find the most useful when talking about on the ground effects of climate change and impacts.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Amber, for the fantastic presentation and also for the great answers to all of the questions that we have. And thank you to all of you for joining us today and for the great questions that you posed to our speaker. So everyone give her like a virtual round of applause.
Thanks to all of you, and thanks to you, Heather and NPS.
Thank you all so much. Have a great day.